Hi, I'm Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology. This video is called Different Approaches, Different Assumptions. And what we're going to do today is talk about some of the differences between modern astrology and medieval Renaissance astrology. This is kind of brought to a head. I had a poster say to me, they emailed, on the group and they said, hey, I'm looking for some traditional sources that explain to me the meaning of planets and signs other than essential dignity. So I can't find any, and I wonder if you could just point me to some. I thought this was really interesting, and I really did thank the poster for this because I thought it was really a useful teaching moment. And again, I really didn't want to be, criticizing them or, I'm not, it's not meant as saying, okay, this is coming to a bad question or something. What it really does is reveal the differences in approach between the medieval Renaissance and modern astrology. And really what we're coming down to is the fact that each of us has a perspective, and we're looking from that particular perspective, and we want to be aware of that perspective. I mean, the problem is the idea that somehow, it becomes unconscious that this is an individual perspective and that we take it as a universal, and then of course everybody agrees with me and everybody thinks the way I do because that's the right way. So if we think about this question of where can I find traditional sources that tell me the meaning of planets and signs other than essential dignity, I mean, really the essence of this question, in a way, you could push it to an extreme so you can kind of see what the underlying sort of feel of it is a bit like asking, how do they celebrate 4th of July in Japan? Well, obviously they don't, because 4th of July is American independence. The Japanese are not. They don't observe it at all. So really what the problem with this, planets and signs, is that this is a modern way of approaching the question. It's not universal to all astrology. It's something that comes from a modern perspective. And so, but, really, if we want to push this in a deeper way, it's like, well, why is it that modern astrology is so focused on this meaning of planets and signs? Why is this something that we could assume is true of all astrology, because it's very true of modern astrology? So it certainly is true that the planets and signs are very much constantly used in modern astrology. And what they're used for is predominantly for psychological analysis. So you have a sort of basic psychological sort of feel of the planet, that what it represents, the meaning that the planet has, and that's modified, again, by the basic meaning of the sign. So for example, if you take the moon as representing emotions, and then Aries as representing fiery and passionate and changeable, so the moon in Aries shows emotions that are fiery and changeable. So, there's logical. And of course what we're doing is we're looking at natal charts. Because again, for modern astrology, predominantly astrology means natal astrology. So I think that that's sort of the basic approach. And we've essentially got, almost you could think of it as light. You've got these different types of light that are put off by each planet, and then they're modulated or they're changed depending on how that light goes through. It's almost like stained glass. Each sign is like a different color of stained glass, and then the light from each planet is a different aspect of the psyche. Again, perfectly reasonable approach. I use it myself when I do psychological. In fact, I really like psychological readings, and it's something that I've used and picked up. I call it traditional psychological reading, which is a little bit paradoxical because they didn't do psychological readings. Really, psychology is anachronistic for medieval Renaissance astrology. Obviously, they thought about how people behaved and things like that in their mind, but they sort of analyzed it in terms of character or manners, and they had different methodologies of delineating character and manners than planets and signs. The other thing that's really interesting, I think, about it is that it's interesting. I was looking at this sun sign book. It was actually with sun and moon. So it wasn't just sun signs, it was sun and moon. So instead of having just 12 basic types as you would for the signs, you've got 144 types. But what kind of struck me as I was looking at this yesterday was every single one was overwhelmingly positive. And they had a little bit in there that was negative. They called it weaknesses. But they wouldn't even say it's bad. They just said it's sort of weakness. So that's really very much also part of the assumption of modern astrology, is that pretty much everything's positive. Medieval Renaissance is different in that because it's so predictive and so based on concrete events, there's a range in traditional astrology that runs between very strong to weak to afflicted. And you kind of use a lot of different factors to, find out where you are on that spectrum. But it's not unreasonable if your only perspective is modern astrology, to assume that the same, planets and signs thing and the same sort of approach, the positive approach, would be true of the medieval Renaissance as well. So, and really, if we think about why is this so important in modern astrology, it really comes down to the predominance of what's called a star sign, in other words, the sun sign, which is the sign that the planet was in at your birth. And this probably is the most important technique in modern astrology in terms of it's most widely used. I mean, obviously there's much more sophistication with modern astrologers looking at charts, but if you just look at it as a whole, at what people think of as modern astrology, you're going to find sun signs as predominant. And even in, when people are doing full chart elections, they're still going to be very, very focused on certainly the sun and signs, but extending that, what planets and what are in what signs. So the assumption would be that, well, since it's such an important technique and so predominant in what I do, it must be true for all kinds of astrology. But in fact, rather than it being, the predominant technique and the most important thing to look at and everything, the reason it's so overwhelmingly used in modern astrology is because the sun signs are extremely easy to determine. And so almost all medieval and Renaissance astrological techniques, you need a full chart. You need to be looking at the chart for specific time, date, and place. You can see where the planets are. You can see the houses. You can see all that sort of stuff, aspects, things like that. And that's also true of a lot of modern astrological techniques. You're going to need to see the full chart. But and even to the point of, if you want to know what sign any planet other than the sun is in, you're going to, again, probably need a chart or an ephemeris, a specific ephemeris, except for sun signs. Now, sun signs, you don't even need to know your year of birth. All you need to know is the month and the day, and then you know what sign the sun is in. So that's really easy to do. And that's also given rise to this idea of cusps. Okay? You hear that a lot. You say, well, I'm on the cusp of, Aquarius and Pisces or whatever. And that only comes about from the fact that people are using these, by day, right? I mean, it says, that Leo is from this day to this day. And so if you're right on the edge, they're like, oh, it's on the cusp. If you have a full chart election, if you actually look at your real time, date, and place and location, your real chart, the planets are always going to be in a specific sign. They're never going to be in both. Okay, they're not on the cusp. They'll be just barely in Aries or just barely in Pisces. They're not going to be right in the middle. Okay, that's impossible. The only way that, again, that comes about, and the whole cusp thing has come about because people are not doing a full chart election. They're actually looking it up, in something that's listing it by day. So that's another good example of something that's come about. This whole, people have all delineations and what it means and all that. Not, again, because it's necessarily meaningful in and of itself, but because that's the form in which it was presented to them. So they look at the form and they assume that must be meaningful, and not understand the deeper underlying stuff. So again, it could be, it may be that cusp is a very valid technique, but it is useful and interesting to understand where that's coming from. Another example of this is what are called planetary aspect patterns or planetary patterns. It's things like the Grand Trine, Grand Cross. There's a lot of these sort of things. And if you're steeped in modern astrology, again, you might ask, well, how's a Grand Trine come up in medieval Renaissance astrology? And they don't use it. And it's not for some great philosophical reason. There's not some huge problem with it. It's just because of the fact that the only way you can see these planetary aspect patterns is in a round chart that has aspect lines on it. And traditional astrologers, medieval Renaissance astrologers up till basically the late 17th century, used square charts, and they didn't have aspect lines on them. So no aspect lines, no planetary patterns. And so again, this is not something I have done a lot of research on, but my impression is that at some point a modern astrologer looked at that chart with the aspect lines and said, hey, wow, look at these patterns. They look important, therefore they must be important. And so this is really in tune with a lot of the way that things are done in modern astrology, which is that, basically they just make it up on the spot. And again, I not to say that that's wrong or that means it's automatically invalid. And all these, modern techniques, aspect patterns, astrocartography, things like that, they are not necessarily invalid just because have been sort of made up on the spot. The real problem is not realizing it and then going back and trying to validate it and testing it, quote, testing it, using sort of subjective anecdotal hindsight. So you had one circumstance with something that just was for you, and so that proves the whole thing because it happened once. Or the classic way is like, oh, look at Einstein's chart. So we already know what happened with Einstein, and we can look at the chart or Hitler's chart. Oh, look, you can see there's some kind of progression that's taking place at this particular point in Normandy, so that proves Normandy. Not that you can do it in advance, but you look at the chart and go with hindsight, and you can basically prove anything with hindsight. So that's problematic. And so it may well be that 1,000 years from now, if we're still around, that astrocartography has been really, it's been proven. There's been 1,000 years of history. Medieval Renaissance astrology uses techniques that actually have been in existence for a millennium. And more importantly, the pattern in medieval Renaissance is to try to make a judgment based on multiple factors and not just use a single technique. And I think that's that's in a lot of ways the Achilles heel of a lot of modern astrology, because they'll come along, they'll find some pattern that they think no one else has used before. They get very excited about it. This is going to revolutionize astrology. It predicts everything. It's perfect. And then when other people try it, it doesn't work very well. And then after a while, it doesn't do so well for even the person that created it. And part of the problem there is because they're only using one technique rather than, as I said, in the medieval Renaissance, you typically want to judge on multiple factors. I don't like to judge on one factor and do my interpretation. I want to basically look through the chart and see the underlying spiritual pattern that the chart is reflecting. And then that's my methodology of delineation. But again, that's not to be saying that mine is right and everybody else is wrong. People doing modern astrology can do incredibly accurate prediction. And so it's, again, really more of a matter of saying, do you know what you're doing? Are you aware of the perspective that you have, that you even have a perspective, and then where that came from? And I think that's what's mostly useful. So while we're here, though, let's talk a little bit about the use of signs and the interaction of planets and signs in medieval Renaissance astrology. Really, the major use of planets and signs is going to be essential dignity. So, if you're not familiar with that, essential dignity is a very ancient methodology whereby you look at the planetary ruler of the sign and you get +5. The exaltation ruler, and the exaltation ruler, if it's in its exaltation sign, will get +4. Triplicities, which are air, earth, fire, and water, and they have various means of that. The triplicity ruler for it's appropriate for that chart, we get +3. You have terms, which are subdivisions of the sign, again ruled by planets, and if you're in your own term, you get +2. And then faces, which are 36 faces, 3 degrees per sign, 10 degrees per face, and again, if you're in your own face, you get the +1. And then you have the essential abilities, which are detriment, which is the sign opposite to the sign you rule, and fall, which is the sign opposite to your exaltation. So that's -4. And then peregrine, which is 0. I take it as 0. Lily, there's disagreement. It's like I have the ultimate authority on this, but I take peregrine as being a 0 because it has neither essential dignity or debility. And that's the main use of the planets and signs that's constantly coming up. And what that is a measure of their strength. So if a planet's in sign, it's very strong. If a planet's in detriment, it's either very weak or very strongly malefic. It could have, that's another nuance there, is whether it's strong or whether it's just really weak, strong for evil or weak. And that's the predominant use of it. The signs have a tremendous number of really interesting classifications in medieval Renaissance. And most of these have not continued into modern astrology. I mean, the one that is this division into movable in modern called cardinal, common signs in modern called mutable signs, and then fixed signs. And so these, like for example, a movable sign like Aries or Cancer, they have a tendency of things happen faster. I mean, you might psychologically say someone was rash, or they change constantly. Whereas if there was a fixed sign, you psychologically could say that they're stubborn. It would tend to indicate things are not going to change, like in horary, whereas in a movable sign, they're going to change quickly. And then common could be changing back and forth. For example, if you have common signs for an illness, that could be an illness that's cured and then recurs again. Common signs are also called bicorporeal signs, two-bodied. And Lilly, the English horary astrologer, says that they're called bicorporeal or double-bodied signs because they represent two bodies, like Gemini is the twins or Pisces is two fishes. So that's another. But there's all sorts of different classifications of the signs. There's humane signs, Aquarius, Gemini, Libra, and Virgo. These have people on them and not animals. And so they're signs that chew the cud. Those are animals that actually they're, aren't like a lion doesn't chew the cud. So Leo's not a sign that chews the cud, but Taurus would be because it's a cow and they do. Um, Fertile and barren signs, those are very useful for delineating like fertility or for, for whether of a person, like conception or pregnancy, or for like crops or something. If you want things to grow, you might use a fertile sign. So if you look at my website, renaissanceastrology.com, I have a whole section on signs, and you can go take a look at. There's all sorts of links. And I think that those are very interesting, but they're not really used the way the modern sort of planets and signs are. I, again, off the internet, like took the first Google, result for that, and they just they have a whole listing of every planet in every sign. And they said, for example, Mars and Leo's people are fun-loving, are always on the ready to go for a new adventure, while Mercury and Leo people have excellent communication skills and turn the situation in their favor. The Moon and Sagittarius are fun lovers, always on the lookout for an adventure. So very much like I was saying, it's psychological, it's natal, and it's based on basically there's a basic meaning for each planet, and then that's modified by the signs. On the other hand, Lily was talking about these various listings of different kinds of signs. He says, how do you use them? He says, for example, if your significator in your question, like a horary question of the Lord of the Ascendant, is in Aries, Taurus, Leo, or Sagittarius, he says that means that the person is kind of like that animal. So if it's in Aries, they're rash and hardy and lascivious, like a ram. If you're in Taurus, then it's steadfast and resolved and somewhat muddy. It says vitiated with private imperfections. So again, it's sort of like a bull. Stubborn, that sort of thing. So he said another one is that if you had with fertile signs, if you had the moon and the significator of children, or the significator of the person asking the question, and fruitful signs, then that's an indication that the person is going to have children. And then finally he said if humane signs like Gemini, Virgo, Aquarius ascend, or the Lord of the Ascendant is in the humane sign, then that person is going to be very pleasant, very affable, easy, humane, in that sense of it. So you can see that it's really not the same. I mean, it's first of all integrated into traditional technique so that you've got these different significators. It's not always the sun or the moon as natural rulers of the emotion. It's going to depend on the chart. And then it depends on what you look at. Sometimes we're looking at the moon. Other times we're looking at the significator. Lord of the Ascendant's obviously important in a question. Again, it's integrated into that full chart. It really doesn't stand alone. I mean, the modern, it's kind of standalone. You could say sun in this is, this sign is this kind of person. So I think it's interesting. Certainly you do have some direct use of the planets and signs. Lilly, and again, his Christian Astrology at page 119, he's got a table and it has all the planets and all the signs, and then the planet and the sign then indicates a part of the body. So it's sort of like if you're trying to do diagnosis of an illness. So he says, for example, Saturn in Aries would indicate the breasts and the arms, while Moon in Pisces would be the thighs and the feet. So that would kind of narrow things down in terms of where the illness was taking place. That's a sort of diagnostic technique. More typical than planets and signs would be planets and houses. So a lot of our traditional sources will say, Jupiter in the 12th, Jupiter in the 1st, Jupiter in the 2nd, what that means. You have situations where you have, for example, Jupiter and the signs ruled by Saturn. That's about as close as we can get to the planets and signs in modern astrology. But it doesn't have an individual meaning for Capricorn and Aquarius. They're kind of taken as, it's more like Saturn being in a sign that's ruled by Saturn. Jupiter in a sign ruled by Saturn would have Jupiter's influence be modified by Saturn, not by the signs. So the signs definitely are important in traditional astrology. They're just not used the same. And I think that's, again, you wouldn't want to look at these techniques and say, well, this one's right or this one's wrong. Basically, what you want to do is to say, okay, well, this is the perspective that's taken in these different types of astrology. This is where it came from. This is where it's coming from. This is what it's used for. And I think that's probably the most important thing to do. I mean, obviously, though my focus is medieval Renaissance, I found modern astrology very useful and for psychological analysis. And I think that's really the key there. But what we want to do is try to step away from these automatic assumptions and assuming that the perspective that we're looking for is not individual but universal. So again, this is kind of fitting into my whole theme of sort of metastructures. That's become my new sort of obsession in astrology, is looking at these sort of underlying structures, underlying themes, and underlying worldview that that we work from for astrology and kind of bringing that to consciousness. So really what you want to do is to be conscious of what you're using, be conscious of your attitudes and methodologies, and then follow the one that resonates for you. Nobody can say for you what's right or what's wrong. You have to find that yourself. So again, great talking to you. You can check this, like I said, the science stuff out on my website, renaissanceastrology.com.